What's happening, Planet X? Gavin chilling here this week with Chris Arens. Thanks for coming in. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Gavin.
So everybody knows Chris from his surf journalism. He's done multiple books. If you know surfing industry, you know Chris. Chris, I want to know how you got into it. What started it all? Hit me from the home base.
Well, Gavin, it started when I learned to tell stories, that is, when I was about 13 years old. I grew up in a crappy little town called Montebello, which is a great reason to travel. And we would hitchhike to Huntington Beach.
Nice.
And
hitchhike.
I'd get down to Huntington and come home, and then Monday morning people would go, "How was the surf?" I'd say it was 10 foot and I shot the pier. Yeah. And people would go, "You don't even know how to surf. You didn't shoot the pier." And I went, so the next time I'd say it was 2 feet and nobody cared.
Yep.
So I learned to say things like it was 6 feet. I borrowed a guy's board. I broke his board trying to shoot the pier, and the guy chased me out of the water. Now that's a good story.
More authentic.
More authentic, it's believable. But so with me, learning to write surf stories was just learning how to lie convincingly, in a way.
So surf journalism, what year was this?
Well, going back, I worked for Trax in Australia. Cool. I was broke. I had a camera. I wanted to be a surf photographer. I had a camera. Camera got stolen.
Of course.
And I had just enough money to get a little pad and a pencil, and I hand wrote some things that I sent to Trax, and they published it. And I went, I'm a writer. Here's $50. I can sleep on the beach for a month on $50.
Nice, that's the life. That's awesome.
Oh, it was a wonderful life.
Surf journalism right here with Chris. So we're going to go from his first stories to, I believe, his most recent stories right here at Planet X. Chris, you want to tell me more about that?
Well, yeah, Gavin. This latest story, Behold What Is Greater Than Thyself, it's a story of a young surfer who had an alcoholic father, and he thinks he's killed his father. He finally strikes back to his father. He's 15 years old, lives in Newport Beach, hitchhikes, and ends up in all places Mission Beach.
Nice, okay.
But then smuggles himself into Baja and is raised by a Mexican fishing family. Cool. Who teach him values, teach him family, teach him to fish, teach him to take care of himself. And then he realizes his father's still alive and has to go back and face the music. Through the story, he finds big waves and surf adventure and everything. It's a surf story, but it's a coming-of-age story. It's kind of like a Huckleberry Finn sort of story.
Oh, cool.
Well, Baja's like the Mississippi River, yeah. And this guy Jose is like Jim from Huckleberry Finn. So I always thought it fit really well, and that's the book.
That's the book. Behold, you guys, check it out. Chris Arens will be right back after this.
Planet X TV.
All right, Planet X, Gavin back here with Chris, awesome surf journalist of the surf world. I got a few questions, Chris. Since you've been around it, you've been writing about it forever, the surf world. What was the surf scene back in the 70s, let's say the 80s, and even all the way with some 90s in there? What was the surf scene like?
The 70s were a transition era, Gavin, as you probably know. Shortboards were coming in. It was called the shortboard revolution.
Okay.
And so we had all these beautiful surfboards. I remember surfing went soul. People were making boards in their garages, making boards in their front rooms. And there was, my mother always knew what color my surfboard was by what color was on the refrigerator, because there was resin smeared everywhere. We were a mess. I remember my mom used to talk in her sleep. She woke up one night saying, "Chris, you filthy pig." And it was because of our surfboard making.
Surfboards.
Planet X TV.
All right, Planet X. Chris is just getting into what his favorite memory of the 70s/1969 was in Maui. Let's hear it.
1969, I'd made a board in my parents' garage, and I thought it was a great board, and I took it to Maui, and the surf when I got there was head high, and I had a great time on it. I thought it works pretty well. Yeah. But then 1969 turned out to be the storm of the century. The biggest waves that possibly had hit Honolulu Bay ever.
Wow. Okay.
And I'm there with my garage board, and back then there was no way to know if the surf was up or not. You'd kind of guess.
The tide charts.
Tide charts, and you'd hear that surf was coming, but I lived on a side of the island where I could tell. In Lahaina, people wouldn't know. So the surf had come in, and it was big. And I went to Honolulu Bay.
Nice.
And I was alone. I had this board that I'd made, caught about 3 waves, and then broke my board.
Oh shit.
And it was the worst feel. I mean, to be in paradise and not have the tools to enjoy paradise is hell.
Yeah,
you know, so you're kind of like, I've been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And sitting on the cliff, my brother showed up, and I asked him if I could borrow his board, and he goes, "Well, you broke your board. Why should I let you borrow my board?" It was before leashes hadn't been invented.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And that beach that's some coarse grained sand there.
Yeah, it's gonna mess it up.
Oh, and it broke my board like a twig. Herbie Fletcher, who has been around Planet X forever.
Big name.
Was one of the people that really dominated there, and at that time it was Jock Sutherland, Jeff Hackman, a guy named Les Potts from Maui was amazing, Buddy Boy Kahoe. It was a time of, once again, it was a time of change. The guys that I had looked up to as a kid were no longer as relevant. A lot of them had quit surfing. The boards, they didn't relate. It was like suddenly Jimi Hendrix comes in and somebody's playing, and Peter, Paul, and Mary, well, where are they? Who are they? I don't want to hear that anymore. I want to hear Hendrix. And it was really a different scene. And everything about it was different. And in some ways better, in some ways you get nostalgic for. But what happened later, it took about 7 or 8 years for the longboard to come back. There weren't no longboards. They did not exist.
70s, the area of just mystic with the longboards.
Well, it was about, I moved to Australia in 72 and was gone for 2 years. And when I came back, the surf seemed crowded and I wanted to surf here. So it was about 75, and I thought, oh, a longboard. And Donald Takayama was starting to make some of them, legendary Donald Takayama. And he made a surfboard for me. He actually made one for my friend Pat Beckett, and Steve Moray made one. He used to ghost shape for Mike Henson.
Okay.
He made me an 810.
Big board.
And it was like having your own secret spot. You could go out at shoulder-high Swamis and surf it by yourself, or here at Sunset Cliffs.
Yeah, it's nice.
Because people simply did not ride longboards. And so the 70s, to me, were a really interesting time, because it was a time of change and then change again. One of the changes was away from tradition, and the next change was back to tradition. And the 80s carried through with that. And then by the time I'm getting older, by the 80s, I'm going, well, okay, longboards. And then in the 90s, the Tudor family, we'd see the Tudor family down at the beach, and their son Joel was one of the people that would always hang out and come over and look for a sandwich. And I go, that kid surfs really good for being 14 years old. Yeah. And he understood the old ways. He'd seen the movies. He knew the moves. He had that style. He understood that there was more to it than just running up and hanging 10.
I want to know what your opinion is on the future of the surf industry. What do you think the surf's going to be like 5-10 years on the actual wave and off the wave?
To answer that, Gavin, I have to actually go back to the 70s. I remember sitting around at Swami's with this big wave legend, Ken Bradshaw. He and I were roommates about 1970, before he went to Hawaii. And we were sitting there and we were discussing the idea of being able to actually leave the wave and land an aerial. And it just seemed impossible.
Oh, right.
But cool. So we could visualize it.
Any attempts?
The first attempts that I saw were in the mid-70s. Kevin Reed at Steamer Lane, I saw about 75 was the first one I ever saw landed. And then Christian Fletcher became the aerial guy, because Herbie was always a very innovative surfer with the side slip and had different things that he was doing, and Christian picked that up and picked up the 80 and made it into a legitimate move.
Yeah.
then now it's just like, if you can't do an aerial, you're not on the tour.
Yeah, it's a kickflip on a skateboard. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's going back to the 70s to explain the future of the surfboard. You're thinking a lot of aerials, a lot of crazy moves.
I don't know. I mean, who would have ever thought that the 90s would be dominated by 9.6s?
Yeah.
9.6 single fins.
Single fins, yeah.
You know, the boards that we cut down.
You cruise in.
It became some of the most influential surfboards of the time, at least for the recreational surfer. So it's, I think, impossible to say. What I think is, I talk a lot with Tom Morey and Carl Ekstrom, good friends of mine, and I can envision a surfboard that's actually computerized, that when you, like a fish, you fish, so
Sure.
you watch fish, and they extend their fins as they need it. It's not a rigid fin. So what if you had a surfboard and you're turning, and suddenly the fin starts coming out of the rail, and you get more fin? The more pressure you have on your rail, the more fin you have to turn with. What if, you know, your board is more adapting to the wave? Because at this point, I think surfboards in 20 years, the surfboards we have now are going to look very crude.
Yeah.
Because there's still a solid object. Mm-hmm. They're still not molding to the wave. And there's nothing in nature like that. No bird. A bird's not a solid object. A fish is not a solid object. They're adapting to their condition. And we're stuck with this solid object. Now, that's probably a long ways away, and I'm sure not the one to make a board like that. But my point is that somebody's going to come up with something that's going to change the game. Put 3 fins on a board. Ride a board that's 6 feet, 6'2" at Chopu.
Yeah.
Damian Hobgood, and change the world, and change our perception of what the world can be. So all bets are off, and I'm not gonna. No predictions from me.
That's funny. So on the wave, the technology is probably gonna happen. Now that you've said, you probably just gave somebody $10 million idea, and they're gonna come out with this crazy surfboard. So, hey, Chris Arens right here on Planet X just came up with it first. We patented it. So what about off the wave? The surf industry, everybody's coming up. There's so much of a gap. These big corporates are coming in. The small guys are trying to take over. What do you think about the surf industry off the wave?
The surf industry, it's basically, surf industry is my favorite oxymoron. I never heard of a surf industry.
Yeah.
I go surfing, and there are. I applaud the people that are responsible, that look toward helping to clean up the ocean, toward making surfing better. People that are doing it to simply line their pockets, I won't wear their clothes.
Gotcha. I gotcha. Chris Arens, surf industry, right here, Planet X.
Shall we hold it for a minute or let it go?
Yeah, I gotta find out my next question.
Okay.
I mean, that might have been, you know.
Planet X TV.